The first thing I want to talk about is cutting wire and just basic wire shaping. So make sure you have all of your tools and equipment at hand. For this, you definitely need your safety glasses. So wear those at all times because we talked about in class, when you cut the wire with these pliers, it kind of cuts at two ends like this. Um, and so this is very sharp, like the point of the wire is very sharp. Um, and you don't want that either flying up into your eye, or if you are working with a very long piece of wire, having it like accidentally scratch you, or if it's really long, scratch your neighbor in the process of you working. So we have three different wires. We have 14 gauge wire, we have 19 gauge wire, we have 22 gauge wire, and they all have kind of their own purpose for this assignment. You can see there's different line weights, so you can play with line weight with your design. Um, I would use the 14 gauge wire for larger elements and more structural elements. And then the 18 gauge as smaller elements that might still need to maintain structure, and I mean 19 gauge. And then the 22 gauge is great for kind of filler, linear moments, or tightening those connections. So usually I use this almost like a thread where I'm kind of tying things off. So I'm going to start with just even cutting the wire itself. And you can see it comes off the spool kind of gnarly, a little wavy. And you have to kind of go back in and straighten it out. And it won't be perfectly straight, but this, you don't want to maintain this in your piece. That shows poor craftsmanship. So even though we're working with organic forms, you still want to kind of manipulate the material to work best for you. So your pliers have three sections, and you can probably barely see in this video, but you can look at your own pliers. So it's very likely going to have a textured, kind of ridged section that's at the top, and that is for crimping things down. And really, the ridges grab the wire so that you can really put a lot of pressure on it. There's also this flat section, so you can put pressure on your wire without kind of scratching it, but it doesn't have the same grab that the top does. And then there's a section at the back, which hopefully all of your wires have, because this is the wire cutter section. So you cannot cut wire without wire cutters. You can't use scissors or anything else. So you really need to have hopefully pliers with a wire cutter on the back. And then you would not try to cut your pliers up here because there's nothing there to actually go through it. You need to put your pliers all the way to the back towards the hinge, and then you put pressure on the pliers until they close, and then that cuts your wire. And maybe you can see, probably not, that it's a fairly sharp cut. So I have scratched myself many times using wire. So say you have a lot of difficulty getting through the wire. The 14 gauge is particularly bad for this, or people just really struggle with getting it off, getting it cut, because it requires so much pressure. So you can actually just put a little bit of pressure on your pliers just so you can like feel it kind of pinching down, and then you can move the pliers back and forth without actually releasing the wire, and that will start to, like, as you kind of move the wire, um, because it's a steel wire, and most metals have lots of molecules, that the more they move around, they kind of start to spread apart. And then so the more you work it, it makes the material more brittle, and then eventually it will break. So you have to be careful if you're overworking your wire sculpture not to um, accidentally start to snap your wire because you're being too indecisive, and it's you're starting to kind of break it down. So just be careful if you tend to be really indecisive, have practice pieces. And so how you straighten the wires, I go with my pliers and I just do kind of really small movements. You can see my hand is not moving that much. And I put the pliers kind of next to where there's a bump. So I don't put them on the bump to push down. I put them next to it to kind of counter move against that. And I go all the way down the wire because every time I make a movement, I have to kind of correct it in the spot next to it. So it does take a minute to stretch the wire, to straighten the wire out. And you won't get it perfectly straight. We are making organic sculptures, so it doesn't matter a whole lot. But, you know, this compared to this is very different, especially the top where I actually worked. So you want to kind of pay attention to that. So as I said, this is kind of better for larger pieces. So you can get a nice long piece of wire and start to shape it. I kind of made this cube with one long piece of wire. It's a little small for that wire, but it does enough. So this is where you might do your kind of main contour lines. And I wanted to show you, like, as you're working with it, using the pliers as almost like you're kind of pinching the wire with the pliers. And then I usually roll the pliers to make, even when I need to make an angle or a round, I sort of roll the pliers to do these incremental movements. I don't really know what I'm making here. And yes, you do want to straighten the wire out, even if you're going to do an organic contour like this, because you want sort of the best starting point possible. So there's my little contour, but you can sort of see where you can make kind of a larger piece. I'm going to do another video that shows connections because I found that the video, them all in one, is too long. So this is one way you can work with wire, just to sort of sculpt those contours, is to use the pliers. Say I was referencing one of Haeckel's lichens, like this would be that kind of edge I was going after. Say I want something else that's maybe a little bit different. So I'm gonna kind of make a floral shape. And you'll see another version of this in my next demo. So you can actually take one long piece of wire, and honestly, if I was making a bigger, full shape, I would cut a much longer piece, but I wanted to kind of keep this on the video. But you can start to shape, you can sort of see where this is going. And I kind of use a hybrid of my, especially with the thinner gauge wires, I use a hybrid of my hands and the wire cutters to sculpt with. But you can see how you can start to kind of draw, make a small petal here, kind of draw out a form just from kind of going back and forth with the wire. And I expect you to sort of play with things and figure out your own methods using these techniques. So I would then, and I want you to refer to my connections video after this, then go in and wind wire around all of these parts and thread it through these loops to actually start to connect it all together. And then you can also, this is the 22 gauge wire, you can also do kind of goofy things like winding wire around something. And in this case, this wire is so thin, I didn't even need the pliers. I am going to use them though to tuck in the ends because I don't want to use my thumbs because the wire might kind of go through my thumb. So you can wind it around an object, and then there I have this magical spring that I just made, and I can stretch it out and start to sculpt with it. Just be careful with stuff like this because it can get really cheesy really fast. So I might regret showing this to you. But I can like kind of open it up and make it more irregular. But I have a starting point with that form, and I'm sort of changing the memory of the material, so I'm not overworking it too much to work with it later. Um, so, um, so this is the basics of wire cutting and just sort of shaping the wire. Um, remember, you always kind of want to put your pliers exactly where you want to bend it. Um, you don't want to like put your pliers over here and expect it to bend. It's you want the most control is to put the pliers exactly where you're going in order to bend it. And then to sort of play with different ways that you can um, use a long wire. So it's much better to kind of maximize your energy. Even kind of similar with like paper scoring, it's much easier to sort of plan out a form and score those lines to bend like a full form out of that versus like making a piece out of lots of different, like making a form out of lots of different pieces. So you kind of need to know like where you need to work with one long line and where you'll need to work with multiple parts. And I'll show you a little bit about connections next.